You're listening to Inside the Notes. I'm your host, Erica Block. Here we have the opportunity to listen to the stories that connect our musical family tree. First-hand accounts of performances, musicians, and mentors that shape the way we listen, learn, and teach. On today's episode, we are chatting with pianist and conductor Benjamin Hochman. Thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Benjamin is in Bellingham for a performance of Bartok's Piano Concerto No. 3, an amazing piece. Could you tell us a little bit about your experience with the piece and maybe the first time you played it?
So actually, I have an interesting connection to this piece because the first time I played it was on tour with the orchestra of the Bartok Conservatory, where I'm a piano faculty. And the circumstances were that I got called in pretty last minute to replace an indisposed Peter Serkin.
Wow.
And so I found myself in the situation of playing the piece for the first time in St. Petersburg, Russia, Berlin, Vienna, and Budapest.
Wow, that's incredible.
So at the time, I admit it was pretty stressful, but it was an incredible experience, not only to play in these incredible halls, but also to play, especially in the Zene Academia, the Liszt Academy in Budapest.
Absolutely.
Which is, of course, Bartok's hometown.
Absolutely. Are there certain pitfalls that the concerto has? Is there something unique to it as a pianist that you have to look through?
I think every concerto has its pitfalls, so to speak. I think what's interesting about this piece is that oftentimes people speak about the third Bartok Piano Concerto as being, quote unquote, the lighter or the easier concerto of the Bartok concertos. And in some way that's true because it doesn't have the kind of extroverted, brawny, muscular ferocity that the second has, the first has. But in its own way, it is deceptively tricky. I think there is a kind of classicism in the piece. You know, to me, it's reminiscent of Mozart and Brahms and Beethoven in various ways that maybe we can talk about later on. But it's also distinctly Bartok. It has a kind of clarity and transparency, which means you're exposed.
Right.
So that's always tricky. So it has its challenges, but most of all, it's just an incredible piece of music.
Absolutely. There's a playfulness and a lightness, but the rhythms are still his rhythms.
Yes.
So it's hard to keep them to be authentic, but still light.
Right. There's so much in this music. As you said, there's the side of the folk music, the folk rhythms. But for me, Bartok is very much in a certain tradition and a certain continuum of composers. And, for example, the slow movement, the middle movement, is clearly based on the slow movement of a late Beethoven string quartet, the A minor string quartet, opus 132, which has a movement called the Heilige Dankgesang, or the Holy Song of Thanksgiving, which had a lot of significance for Beethoven in the context of his deafness and what he experienced in terms of really being on the verge of committing suicide and deciding to choose life over death. And I think for Bartok, who wrote the third piano concerto at the very end of his life in 1945, in the last months, when he was already in the late stages of leukemia, I think this had a very powerful resonance.
Incredible. So coming into a piece like this last minute, I would love to talk a little bit about your performance preparation and dealing with nerves and dealing with kind of that hot seat moment. Those are the moments that when you get them and it's successful, it's a huge feather in your hat, but they're really hard to manage when you're in it. Do you get nervous? What kinds of things do you go through when you're going to perform?
Oh, how much time do we have? Well, I think any performance has excitement. There's always a certain level of adrenaline which is there. And I think one can channel that in a positive way. There's no guarantee.
Yep.
It's a tightrope act to get out on stage, especially to play a concerto, especially to play a difficult concerto. But I think more than anything else, it's in the preparation. For me, it's really about how deeply did I go into the music in my study? How much time have I spent not only with a particular piece, but with this particular composer, with this tradition of playing? How much information do I have? And, a little bit like a tree that if you were to cut it open and you see the rings, which shows not only the age, but the experience. So for me, it's interesting this week in Bellingham to come back to Bartok 3 a few years later after this tour I was telling you about, and, to see how it feels now.
Right.
And I feel like, okay, I've had that experience. I know that much more about the music. And it becomes part of your DNA. Those experiences you have on stage, for better or for worse.
Right.
Things will always happen, but just having persevered and gotten through it, you're in a better position to do better the next time.
Right. When you revisit something, there's a familiarity and a history there that you have with that piece, and you can come at it from a different angle.
Definitely.
What about the travel side of it? I feel like I look often at soloists, and I have a longing of, I wish I had that much energy. I try and do a lot of stuff, but even that tour, so many cities, running in and out, new piece.
Yes.
How do you manage the travel side and managing your own adrenaline so that you don't totally run out of steam?
Yeah, it's a challenge. I think every traveling musician has their own way to deal with it.
Right.
And for me personally, it's, at this point, it's something that I've developed over the years. You just kind of get to know yourself. So I know what I like to eat.
Right.
I know that I like to drink a lot of water. I know that I like to go running and do yoga and, sit in the morning and, just certain habits that have to do with conserving energy. Just being prepared in advance of a tour is huge.
Right. So that you're not also stressing about
just
the
that
act.
you know that you're ready.
Right.
Because if you're not ready, you're going to be stressed out.
Right.
And if you are ready, you're still going to be stressed out, but at least you know that you're ready.
Exactly.
So that's a huge part of it. And when you're on the road, there are always things that are out of your control.
Yes.
You show up at a hotel and they don't have your reservation, or they give you a room which is by the elevator and it's too loud,
Right.
or of course flight delays, and it can be a disaster sometimes.
Right.
So I think part of it is also trying to be a little bit zen, just accepting,
Right.
To the degree that you're able. Okay, this happens. This is not something I can control.
Yeah.
And then there are other things that you can control. When do I go to bed, and if I'm exercising or just taking care of myself.
Right. Do you feel in your yearly schedule, do you try and plan in breaks, or do you just, it always seems like everything happens in the same couple months and it's feast or famine. Do you just let it be, or do you try to go, I can really only do 5 things in a row, and then I need to take a break?
Yeah, I should probably do that more than I do. No, the truth is that I do try to keep certain periods open. For example, after a very busy year, busy season this year and another busy season coming up next year, I have August free, and I'm kind of keeping my fingers crossed that I'll manage to keep that free. It's always hard because, when you're called to do something, whether it's something that's planned far in advance or something which comes up last minute, if it's music that you love or if it's playing with colleagues that you respect, there's always a really strong pull to do that.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's almost impossible to say no sometimes. And
It's true, but I will say that as I've gotten a little bit older, knowing that it's actually okay to say no. And that's something that I remember Mitsuko Ushida, the great pianist, told me when I was probably in my early 20s. She said that, she said it's okay to say no. Sometimes it's even good to say no. And actually another musician who I respect a lot, the late Ida Levin, wonderful violinist who sadly passed away a few years ago, she used to joke about that, and she used to say that she has a club, the Just Say No Club.
Yes, we all need to join it.
I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. You feel like, well, if I don't say yes, I might not get the next opportunity,
Exactly.
or this is another place for me to prove myself. I better take it.
Exactly.
But sometimes,
and and there are situations that you have to just plow through and just do it.
Yeah.
But if you've done that enough times, then also being able to say no is good.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to talk a little bit about your start. You grew up in Israel. When did you start piano, and what was your experience like there as a young musician?
Right. So I was born and raised in Jerusalem. I started playing the piano relatively late, at 7. I had already had some contact with music, playing the recorder, which is what every kid in Israel plays. And I would say that actually my musical foundation was wonderful. in the sense that the musical culture in Israel is very rich. There's a very strong tradition, and I just had wonderful teachers. And that's something that I feel very fortunate that throughout my life I've just had outstanding teachers, actually at every step of the way.
So lucky.
And that's huge. So I had a very devoted, wonderful piano teacher from the age of, I guess I started with her at 8 or 8.5 after. My very first teacher, she was great too. And then at a certain point after a year or so, she passed me on to her teacher,
right.
a woman by the name of Estelle Melkis. And I was with her for several years. And, she was just a powerhouse of a teacher, a lot of musical culture and really setting the foundation for piano playing. Very interesting woman. She's still alive and well in her getting to be late 80s. Her husband was actually a general in the Israeli army who had a really interesting role in the 1967 war and was kind of a liberator of Jerusalem.
Wow.
That's a whole other story.
It's incredible.
But I remember sometimes having these really long lessons with her, sometimes 2 or 3 hours, and then at a certain point we would take a break and she would serve me some soup. And sometimes we would sit in her kitchen and we would have soup, and sometimes her husband, Uzi, the general, was there, and he had a way of saying, "Pass the salt," with great authority.
And you're like,
and you would give him the salt right away. So Estelle was a wonderful teacher. And, already at the age of 13, 14, I was playing in master classes for people like Claude Frank, who then became my teacher in Curtis a few years later, Gil Kalish, Malcolm Bilson, just wonderful musicians who came to Israel regularly. And so then by the time I was 17 and I auditioned for the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia and was accepted and moved to America to begin my studies at Curtis, I feel like somehow I had certain foundations already at that time that I could build on. And then, the years in Philadelphia were also just incredible. Studying with Claude Frank and, just the unbelievable faculty.
Absolutely.
I got to play for Felix Gallimere.
It's incredible.
I got to play for Pam Frank and Peter Wiley and David Sawyer and just all these giants. And hear the Philadelphia Orchestra every week.
Right.
Hear Andras Schiff and Radu Lupu, who came to play at the Philadelphia Chamber Music Society. And so there was just a really rich musical culture. And I feel very lucky for that.
So it sounds like she really set you up beautifully to be able to go there and kind of immerse yourself immediately and not feel overwhelmed by that. Sometimes a culture shock like that is pretty intense.
Yes,
and it's so small and so potent.
Absolutely. And sometimes I was overwhelmed. I won't lie.
Yeah.
And I also have to mention that I had one more teacher between Estelle and Claude who is a wonderful teacher and wonderful pianist named Immanuel Krasovsky. Born in Lithuania, living in Israel for a long time, and just an outstanding teacher. And even though I was with him for a relatively short period of time, 2 years, he also had a huge influence on me.
Incredible. So what is Claude Frank's his own history line? Who did he study with?
So I'm glad you asked that, because this is always interesting, the kind of musical lineages. So Mr. Frank was a student of Arthur Schnabel.
Wow.
Who was a student of Leczetitsky, who was a student of Czerny, who was a student of Beethoven.
Wow.
So
cool.
It's just interesting, because I think that there are certain things that are passed down, and, I have no pretension to say I know how to play Beethoven. It's not like that. First of all, anyone with enough devotion and hard work can play Beethoven. But I do think that there's certain little things that are transmitted that make a difference. And sometimes that's a specific, piece of information about an articulation or pedal marking.
Right.
For example, if you're playing Tempest Sonata of Beethoven, and there are really interesting pedal markings, much longer than you would think. And so you ask yourself, well, do I really do that? Because the pianos were different, and if I do it on the modern piano, on the concert D, it sounds murky, it sounds messy, and how do you deal with a situation like that?
Right.
It's 150, 200 years later, and you're trying to figure out
what was the sound he was going for.
Yeah. So little things like that, little pieces of information that are passed down. And I also feel that sometimes it's almost by osmosis. Not even necessarily through words. Sometimes it's just seeing how someone sits at the keyboard, or seeing a certain breath that they take, a certain character of the intake of breath before a phrase, or, an approach to music making.
Right, right.
And I think that's very powerful.
I do too. And I think the family tree lineage is what I'm most interested in, because unless you have had the pleasure of studying with that person, some of those things don't necessarily go out to other places. And so you end up with these really specific lineages of people who have been given this gift, even if it's just something they've seen.
Right.
But it very much translates into their own playing. And
Yes.
now we get this wide variety of player.
Yes.
But if you study with another family tree line, some things don't cross over all the time.
That's true. I will say that while I agree very much with what you're saying, I think at the same time it's a little bit dangerous to say, oh, okay, because I studied with Claude Frank, I know how to play Beethoven,
Right.
and maybe someone else who studied with some other wonderful musician who comes
Right.
from a different tradition does not. I don't believe in that.
Right.
I really don't. I do think that with the right approach to music making, with the right kind of hard work and devotion and curiosity and experience, there's always a way to find your interpretation.
Exactly.
And of course, there's no one single interpretation which is the right way. Actually, I'm remembering at the moment something that Claude used to say that came from Schnabel, that Schnabel used to say, great music is always greater than it can be played.
Amazing.
And I think that's just wonderful.
It is.
Because when we're approaching these giants like Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Bartok, the music is so great. And I think that's the incredible thing about being musicians, is that how lucky we are to spend time with this music and immerse ourselves in this music
Right.
and devote our lives to that.
Right.
And if you have that knowledge that, okay, no matter how many times you play Waldstein or Mozart Piano Concerto or Bartok Piano Concerto, it's never going to be perfect.
Right.
And there is no single way which is the right way. There's just the process of aspiring more and more to get closer to the ideal, whatever that is for you as a musician.
Right. And everyone gets their opportunity to go up to it, and it gives endlessly
Exactly.
to
That's
whomever
right.
goes to it.
That's right.
That's amazing. So in that kind of journey through childhood, was there somebody that you listened to, a pianist or any musician or recording that you totally adored, or something that really affected you to kind of put you on fire to keep going?
I mean, so many things all the time. I don't think I could even mention one specifically. There were just so many things constantly. Let's see. I mean, if I try to think.
Or a piece you loved, or a concert you went to where you were like, oh, that was amazing.
Well, okay, I mean, just a couple of associations, almost random associations. But, I grew up hearing the Jerusalem Symphony Orchestra. I remember hearing a performance of Rite of Spring of Stravinsky. Maybe I was, 13, 14. And I remember being totally blown away by that, because I had never heard something like that in my life. I just never heard something so powerful. I didn't know the musical language.
Right.
And it's funny, one of the things I remember about that is that there were some older women sitting next to me at the time. I thought they were old. Maybe today I probably wouldn't think so. But, and what I remember about that is that they weren't into it. They kind of,
Interesting.
they were kind of laughing, like, what is this music? They were kind of the, almost the stereotype of a conservative concert goer
Right.
for whom Stravinsky is something outrageous.
Right.
And actually those two things, my experience of the music being so overwhelmed by the power of Stravinsky, and on the other hand, seeing these people sitting next to me who weren't into it.
Right. Shook by it.
Yeah, actually both of those things were very interesting for me. So that's one thing that comes to mind.
That's great.
Another thing that I remember is, again, in my teenage years, maybe 15, 16, I went into a phase of Mahler. I was obsessed with Mahler. Clearly, I was a very strange kid.
It's a good phase.
But, for example, Das Lied von der Erde.
Yes.
That was a piece that I was just overwhelmed by the experience of listening to that. And that was a recording. It was Klemperer. It was a recording of Klemperer conducting Das Lied von der Erde. And it just... something about it really resonated with me. I remember that. But there are so many things. I mean, we could sit here for hours talking
Right.
about it, because I think that's also part of the experience of being a musician, is being a listener.
Exactly.
And I think about that a lot, even in terms of other arts. I think sometimes about poetry. For example, W.S. Merwin, who's a poet I admire, who passed away recently. And sometimes reading his poetry, I think about what he must have read. And I think for the field of literature, what authors read is very important. And I think it's the same for us as musicians, what we listen to, what scores we study. So I think that approach to music of not only playing or singing or conducting, but listening. Again, it sounds obvious, but what is our frame of reference? How deeply do we have a musical culture that we can draw on?
Absolutely. And recordings that grab you,
Yes.
many recordings of the same piece, but something speaks to you directly, and why, and what is it? And that informs the way that you perform further.
Absolutely.
And when you get a strong opinion of, oh, this is too slow, this is too fast, you
That's
know
right.
it, and it's in your soul.
That's right.
I think that's a fascinating part of the musical experience. So you finished school. How many years between leaving Curtis and your Avery Fisher grant? How many years was that?
I don't know. I should know, but I don't. I would say maybe 9 years or 10 years. Something like that.
So when you leave school, you have this great education. Now it's time to get going as a solo pianist. What do you do?
What do you do?
What happens?
What happens?
And how do they find you?
What a mystery. I wish I knew. No, well, the truth is that
It's an amazing journey.
it's step by step. At least for me, it was step by step. First of all, when I graduated Curtis, I still did another degree. I did a master's of music at the Mannes School of Music in New York City, studying with Richard Good, which was also an incredible experience.
Amazing.
And around the same time, I began to spend my summers at the Marlborough School of Music in Vermont. And shortly after that, I was with the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center. So, all of these different parts of my musical life enriched me so much.
Incredibly.
So much. I mean, working with Richard, unbelievable. Being at Marlborough, just an incredible experience.
Yeah, I feel like Marlborough is so unique and special, and it's such an incredible environment to be in, having that mentor and younger musician situation and chamber music.
It is. It is. I think there's a kind of idealism, which is very powerful. As you said, I think putting young musicians together with these great artists who have been doing it all their life. I mean, for example, I played with David Sawyer, who was the cellist of the Guarneri Quartet. We did a bunch of things. We did Beethoven Archduke Trio and Beethoven Opus 70 No. 2 and Brahms G Minor Quartet. And not only him, Izzy Cohen from the Beaux-Arts Trio, and Sam Rhodes from the Juilliard Quartet, all these giants, and again, that idea of osmosis, that, music it's a craft and almost a kind of, I don't know, the association I have is almost the kind of the medieval trade, what's the word I'm looking for? Artisanship.
Apprenticeship.
Guild, all these words.
Exactly.
It's like being a carpenter.
Yeah.
Or
and you have to see it done.
You have to see how it's done.
Yeah.
And you watch and you listen and you observe and you make your mistakes and all that stuff. So for me, that's what I mean when I say it was a step-by-step thing. It's working with Richard, it's playing with David Sawyer, it's being at Lincoln Center and, being on stage at Alice Tully Hall and, playing Kurtag and Brahms and all these things. And at the same time, also the solo work that I began to do, starting with my recital debut with the Metropolitan Museum in New York and, a long association with the 92nd Street Y and all of these experiences, going to Prussia Cove in Cornwall, England, and working with Ferenc Rados, who was the teacher of András Schiff. Countless experiences.
Right.
So it's not something that happens overnight. You're building a life in music, and with perseverance and devotion to the art.
Right.
You got a
just
chance.
Keep going. You just keep going. So, you just listed off so many incredible kind of mountaintop moments. Have you had something that specifically to you was kind of a pinch me, I can't believe I'm doing this, that was kind of overwhelming to you, or a performance where you, as you were leaving the stage, you had that magical feeling of like, this is it, I can't believe this, or just something that really sticks out to you?
What comes to mind at the moment is playing a Mozart concerto with the Israel Philharmonic, conducted by Pinchas Zuckerman at Carnegie Hall. I was 24. And just being on the main stage of Carnegie, that was overwhelming.
Yeah.
There was something about that experience playing with the great orchestra from my home country, with Benjamin Hochman, who is an artist I admire and was just unbelievably generous in supporting me in my 20s. On that stage with so much history, I mean, that was huge for me.
Yeah, it's incredible. And were you able to keep your wits about you? Were you
I don't
able
know.
to remember anything? Like, is it one of those kind of blackout moments where it's over and it's too much? Or could you feel it while you were there being like, I'm doing it?
Yeah, I mean, I remember being somewhat present, I would say. Yeah, I mean, I can feel it now when I think about it, and there are certain things about it. Just, I remember being on stage, I remember that experience of being on stage. A small thing, but it was so meaningful for me at the time. I had just started working with my artist managers, and they sent me a beautiful bouquet of flowers before my performance, and somehow that was so meaningful to me.
Yes.
That was huge. It was like, oh, okay, somebody cares that I'm about to go on stage at Carnegie Hall.
Yeah.
So that was really meaningful too.
Absolutely.
So all these things add up.
Yeah, they do. Is there something that you've always wanted to play that you haven't yet had a chance to play? Is there a piece that you just can't wait, but the time hasn't shown up yet? Or do you feel like at this point you've played through all of the major rep that...
No, there's always more. It's funny, actually, Yaniv Attal, the music director of Whatcom Symphony, asked me a similar question yesterday at lunch. And at first I replied... Well, he asked the question a little bit differently. He said, he asked, what's on your bucket list?
Yeah.
And so maybe because English is not my my best language, but I said Beethoven 4, Beethoven 4th Piano Concerto, and he looked a little bit perplexed because then he explained that he meant something that I haven't done, whereas I had replied, of course, I've done Beethoven 4 many times, but
right. I
was saying, okay, if that's the last piece I'm going to do.
Right.
But then he asked, okay, something you haven't done. So, but anyway, that's just a reply to your question. But actually, in terms of what I would love to do, it's an ambitious reply. But I'd love to do a cycle of the Beethoven Piano Sonatas, the complete Beethoven Piano Sonatas.
Amazing.
And that will take some time. That's not an overnight thing.
Right.
But at the moment, I'm in the middle of a cycle of the complete Mozart Piano Sonatas, all 18 piano sonatas plus a few additional pieces that are too beautiful to leave out, Adagio and Rondo and so on. So I'm in the middle of that, and I'm thinking about the next cycle, and for me that would be the Beethoven cycle.
What kind of a preparation journey would that take you on? Is that a year's work?
No, I think it's more than that. I don't have a specific timeline. I mean, with a cycle like the Beethoven Piano Sonatas, I mean, it's monumental, it's huge.
Yeah.
And of course, many of the sonatas, perhaps most of the sonatas I have already played, but to do it as a cycle, that's a different kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I don't want to set a specific timeline, but I would say in the coming years.
That's exciting.
Yeah,
exciting.
I would love to do that because there's something about doing a cycle, meaning a complete cycle of works by a great composer. And I'm experiencing that now with Mozart, that you just learn so much about the musical language.
Right. And their growth throughout
and
their compositions.
Exactly. So it's not that it's not worthwhile to do mixed programs, because I do that also. But just because I've never done a concentration like I'm doing now with Mozart, I feel the power that has, and it makes me want to do that.
Exactly.
Next.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's a great segue into composers and compositions and your programming. And I was reading a lot of cool things about how you like to juxtapose new works with, more famous works that might be a good pair, and your experience with these living composers who are becoming very quickly a new level of history. How do you go about your programming when you want to set out to do something like that, or when you want to introduce a new piece to an audience? What are some of the things you think about as far as how you want to present it so that they will receive?
Well,
instead of having a rite of spring experience where they immediately are not interested.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a big question. Well, in terms of my own process, in terms of how I think about programming, it's a little bit obsessive, I admit. And for some of the people who are close to me, they have to deal with hearing endless ideas and programs. I think about it a lot because I'm very interested in that. I'm interested in what goes well together, you know? Like, you know, for example, I just discovered a piece by Rautavaara, great Finnish composer of the 20th century. I discovered a piece I didn't know before called Epitaph for Bartok. It's a piece for strings, meaning for string orchestra, about 10 minutes long. And I thought, oh, that would be really cool to do right before Bartok Divertimento for strings.
Yes.
You know, so that's an example.
Yes.
Okay, I discovered this piece I didn't know by a composer I know of, but I haven't played his music. And making those kinds of connections. I think that's how it works for me.
Right.
You know, just ideas,
Right.
discovering. So I would say curiosity is a big thing. You have to be curious about what's out there, both in terms of things that are known, well known, and things that are lesser known, and making connections. Okay, so that's interesting because it's a kind of homage, you know, which is something I've done before. For example, I have a recording of Schubert where I had a Kurtag homage to Schubert and a piece by Jörg Wiedmann, Schubert Reminiscences. That's one example, you know. Then there's a kind of thinking about, as we were talking before, musical lineage, you know, who studied with whom and why that's interesting, you know. Why is it interesting to think of Beethoven and Bartok?
Right.
You know, why is it interesting to think of Haydn and Beethoven? You know, thinking of connections, relationships, ideas. You know, at the moment I'm thinking about, let's say, the concept of immigration as a kind of theme for programming.
That would be awesome.
That's huge for, especially in America, right?
Yeah.
Because this is a country where everyone at some point
I mean, yeah, they
was
all
an
just
immigrant,
came
right?
over.
You know, so okay, Dvorak did New
Yeah.
World Symphony when he was in New York City, and he was the
Exactly.
founder of the National Conservatory. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And how does that relate to today when, you know, immigration is kind of a hot topic in politics, right?
Right.
What's happening at the borders and, you know, whatever you feel about that, but just what does it mean to be an immigrant? And that raises all kinds of questions that are very much in the world today about representation. And I mean, there's so many things one can think about. But so in terms of my process, it's that kind of curiosity, thinking about ideas, thinking about connections, always wanting to discover. To state something obvious, but I think it's very important, only do good music.
Right. Right.
Don't do music that's not worthwhile.
Right.
Life is too short.
Yes. Just say no.
Yeah, exactly. So it takes time to get to know things well enough to decide, okay, this is really worthwhile, and maybe this is not as worthwhile. So this is kind of the way I think about it. You know, for example, next year I'm doing 2 projects at the 92nd Street Y that are based on the idea of words and music. So the first one is a piano recital, which includes Brahms ballades and Schumann Kreisleriana and a piece by Thomas Adès called Darkness Visible. So these are all pieces that are inspired by literature or poetry. The Adès is based on it's kind of a reframing of a John Dowland piece, actually, in Darkness Let Me Dwell. Kreisleriana is Schumann's piece based on E.T.A. Hoffmann's Kater Mur. Brahms is based on the first piece is based on a Scottish ballad called Edward. You know, so that's an example.
Yeah.
You know, that's a solo piano recital based on words and music. And then the second project puts side by side 2 pieces that I am crazy about. Schoenberg Pierrot Lunaire with the great Lucy Shelton. And we're doing Janacek Diary of One Who Vanished, which is a piece for 2 singers and piano. Unbelievable piece. And so these are 2 pieces almost contemporaneous in their writing.
Right.
Totally different styles, totally different approach to setting the words to music. You know, Schoenberg with his Sprechstimme, which is a kind of in-between speaking and singing, and Janacek in a way more traditional but totally original. I mean, he has a unique voice. No one writes like Janacek.
Right.
So these kinds of ideas,
It's
you know,
fascinating.
be curious, do good music only.
Yeah.
Think about ideas, think about connections, and it's fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you get the opportunity to work with a composer, do you find that you have specific things that you want to know from them, things in the way that they write or the story behind why they wrote it? Are there certain things that you're like, well, I know I'm going to ask these kinds of questions, or do you play it and work with it first and then go to them? What are your thoughts?
It's always different. It just depends. It depends on the composer. And that's the cool thing about working with composers who are alive. You can talk to them. You can text them. You can email them. You can have a conversation. They're not dead. You don't have to guess.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about it. The
so
freshness and the relationship, because I think that feeling of having relationships between composers and performers, and even the fact that these days I feel like there's a gradual transition of returning to performers who compose and composers who perform.
Yes.
Which was totally normal and expected in the 18th and 19th century. And there was a certain point at which there was a kind of divide that came to be between performers and composers. And I feel like that's beginning to change. And I think that's good. And you see that, for example, you see Esa-Pekka Salonen.
Yes.
One of the great composers of our time, who's also one of the great conductors of our time.
Right.
You see that in the younger generation as well. And performers who also improvise. All of these things, it speaks to a kind of creativity. But to get back to your question, it really depends on the composer. It depends. Some composers are very organized and finish things on time. Others maybe
you need to coerce.
You need to chase them a little bit. And some people are very if they say 5 minutes, it's 5 minutes, and some people, if they say 10 minutes, it's 30 minutes.
Right.
And it's, in a way, it's all good.
Yeah.
Sometimes there are surprises, and that's part of the excitement of creation.
Yep.
So I like that process of whether it's commissioning a composer or performing a piece that's been recently composed. It's just exciting to get to know new music and to be able to ask questions, and especially if it's a commission. For example, I had 2 new pieces that were written for me in this past season. One by Gilad Cohen, titled Circles of Time, and one by Jesse Brault, Sonata Shambhala. And I premiered them in November and did them a few times. Both wonderful pieces. Also, as it happens, 2 people who are dear friends of mine. And it was just really, really fun to do these new pieces and work with them and do the premiere and continue to play these pieces. And, now that I'm getting to a certain age, that I already have some, a number of commissions under my belt and have worked with enough composers to see different styles. And it's really exciting.
It is really exciting. This is a great time to talk about your other hat of conducting. So even though all of this is going on, you're playing all over the place, you want to jump into the orchestral repertoire. So you went to Juilliard and TMC.
Yes.
And got started. So how are you incorporating that into the fold of your already enormous career?
I work hard.
Yeah, infinitely.
I really enjoyed it. I feel very lucky that I had a chance to, at a relatively advanced age, embark on a new path and go back to school and, work with Alan Gilbert and go to Juilliard and work with the Juilliard Orchestra every week. I was on the podium conducting 2 symphonies a week for 2 years at Juilliard. And that's just incredible.
It is. It's amazing.
It's just amazing. And, that's something that I feel has enriched my musicianship. I just feel that the period I spent, these few years I spent really focusing on conducting studies, studying scores, getting on the podium, making my mistakes, learning from my mistakes, hopefully, and the kind of broadening of my experience, because as a conductor, there are so many things that you're dealing with. Of course, the physical gesture, but the score study and leadership and communication and, how an orchestra responds and how you can impact the music making in a positive way.
Yeah,
not get in the way and just help people play better.
Right. And when you see a conductor who does do that and brings so much energy to the orchestra and what they're capable of, it's another dimension of the art. and
Absolutely.
your osmosis.
Yes.
There's so much to the visuals of a conductor and what they do and what they bring and how they present their information to the orchestra.
Absolutely.
It's an entirely new level.
Yeah, it's a whole new world.
Have you tried conducting from the bench yet?
I have. In fact, I was just in London. I made a recording, which is coming out this October, of 2 Mozart piano concertos, the G major and the C minor. And I was working with the English Chamber Orchestra and playing and directing from the keyboard. And we really had a wonderful time. And I'm very pleased that there's some interest in future collaborations with them.
That's
and
great.
That's really exciting.
Really fun. It's the perfect blend of the two worlds, a double threat.
Yeah.
So my last question for
Yes.
you is if you have any advice for students who are leaving school and kind of coming out into this world, what are some of the kind of founding things that you think are really important to remember as you're going out and trying to find your way?
Keep the faith.
Yes. Don't
Keep
give
the
up.
faith. Yeah, the music world is a wonderful world, and it's also a difficult world in some ways. There will be ups and downs. There will be challenges, but it is such a rich, worthwhile experience to be a musician, whatever stage you're at, no matter where you are in your development, but thinking of it as a kind of marathon, There will be disappointments. Sometimes things will go well. Sometimes things will go less well. But if you have that connection to the music, which is strong, that's why I say keep the faith. It's like, that's the connection with the music. It's a kind of calling.
Yes.
And just keep working hard.
Yeah.
Believe in yourself, and have your inner compass about what's good for you. Actually, I remember when I was at Curtis and Rostropovich came to conduct. And I remember at some point he was conducting and he stopped and he said, I was talking to the Pope. And when someone says something like that, you just know that you should listen.
It's going to be good.
And the Pope said to me, are you going up or are you going down? That's it,
Awesome.
It's kind of like a Yoda type situation. But I think it's actually not bad.
Yeah.
Is this something that's going to be good for me?
Yeah.
Or not? And if it's good, do it. And if it's not, don't do it. Pretty simple.
End of story.
Pretty powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes you just got to get straight to the black and white of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. This has been fabulous.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Inside the Notes. I'm your host, Erica Block. Be sure to check the Inside the Notes Facebook page for details on our next guest.